This video is sponsored by DistroKid. Of all the mixing tools and techniques out there, understanding compression was arguably one of the most challenging for me. In fact, it led to a lot of mistakes early on. These mistakes included using the wrong compressor for the job, setting the compressor incorrectly so it didn't sound the way that I wanted, and even using compression when I should have actually been using something else in its place, among others of course. Mistakes like these ultimately held my mixes back from sounding their best until I learned from them. And now, over a decade later, with hundreds if not thousands of mixes under my belt, and having my work been featured on major television shows, played at professional sporting events and on hit radio stations, performed at major festivals and more, I've developed a deep understanding of compression and better awareness of how to use it effectively in my mixes. And in this video right here, I want to help you do the same. In the coming sections, I'll be breaking down 9 of the biggest vocal compression mistakes that I see beginners and even some experienced engineers make, so you can avoid them and achieve the professional sounding vocal mixes that you're after. So if you're struggling with using compression on vocals effectively, then this is going to be the perfect video for you. And as a heads up, I did shoot this video a while ago, so when you notice my outfit change and Piper pops up in the background, you know exactly what happened. But while we're on the topic of mistakes, another big mistake that a lot of artists make is using the wrong distributor to get their music onto streaming platforms, and that's where the sponsor of today's video, DistroKid, comes into play. They make getting your music onto stores a breeze with their simple interface, and they pass on 100% of the earnings generated from your music directly to you. Other distributors make you pay every time you upload something, or they keep a percentage of your earnings, which ultimately ends up costing you more. With DistroKid, you pay a low annual subscription fee that lets you distribute unlimited music for the year, making it much more convenient and less expensive than the other guys. DistroKid also gives you access to helpful tools for content creation and marketing your release, including hyperfollow landing pages, the Visi video generator, and much more. Millions of artists, myself included, love using DistroKid, and I'm sure you will too. You can save 7% off your first year by hitting the link down in the description below. Thank you to DistroKid for sponsoring this video, and now, back to the content. The first mistake that I want to highlight, and arguably the most common vocal compression mistake out there, is using compression without intention. One of the main reasons for using compression is to even out the dynamics of a vocal performance, therefore improving its consistency and helping it cut across different listening devices, big and small. But how do you know if a track needs compression or not? I analyze this both audibly and visually. Visually, I start by looking at the waveform of the vocal track and noticing its dynamics. Does the waveform show peaks and dips of varying sizes? Or is it more uniform or even sausage-like? If the waveform is more uniform, compression might have already been applied, and adding more could flatten the vocal out too much. However, if it shows larger peaks and valleys, that may indicate a need for further dynamic control. But of course, we don't watch music, we listen to it. So above all else, you need to listen to the audio and confirm if compression is actually necessary. Listen to the vocal in context, with all the elements of your track playing. Is the vocal sometimes too quiet and other times too loud? Do you find yourself constantly adjusting its volume fader without ever finding a balance that you're satisfied with? If so, that's a clear reason to use compression, to smooth out these volume inconsistencies and ultimately balance the vocal. There are of course other reasons to use compression, and I'll link to another video I did with a deep dive into that up above and in the description below. But the point remains, you should begin with an understanding of what compression does and use it with clear intention and reasoning. If you're unsure, sometimes the best idea is to just leave it and let it breathe naturally. But in some cases, what you're hoping to achieve might actually be better suited to some other processes, and this ties into the second mistake that I want to cover, which is relying on compression alone. Compression is great at reducing loud peaks and controlling overall volume, but it's not always the best tool for preserving the natural dynamic flow of a performance. Take for example a vocal that has a few moments where it's too loud or too quiet, but otherwise has a nice dynamic flow. A compressor can't differentiate between these nuances once the sound passes its threshold. That means if you rely on compression to handle every fluctuation, it may end up flattening the entire performance, erasing the natural highs and lows that keeps a vocal engaging. Rather than relying solely on compression, there are other tools and techniques that you can use to preserve the natural dynamics of the performance but improve its overall consistency. Here are 3 techniques that you can try instead. The first is clip gain adjustment. This is one of the simplest and most effective ways to control vocal dynamics before compression. By manually adjusting the gain at the waveform level, this preserves the natural dynamics of the performance and can often achieve the same results as compression, but without the risk of flattening a sound. It gives you maximum manual control, allowing you to shape the vocal's volume throughout the performance as you see fit. Volume automation is another great technique. By automating the volume of a vocal track, you can apply precise adjustments to specific sections where the vocal might be too loud or too soft. This lets you retain its natural character while avoiding the heavy-handed effect of overcompression. Finally, parallel compression is the third technique worth exploring. Instead of compressing the vocal directly, this method involves mixing producing a compressed version of the vocal with the dry signal. The compressed track controls the peaks and balances of the vocal, while the dry signal preserves its natural dynamics and energy. This gives you the best of both worlds, achieving control without sacrificing the emotional, dynamic feel of the performance. So, next time you're tempted to rely on compression alone, take a step back and consider whether one of the other techniques that I just outlined might be better suited to the problem that you're facing. And that leads us to mistake number 3, relying on only one compressor. The problem with using just one compressor, especially if it's working aggressively, is that it can lead to overcompression or an exaggerated compressed sound, which might make the vocal sound lifeless or flat. Instead of applying aggressive compression with one compressor, try serial compression instead. Serial compression splits the task between two compressors, each with lighter settings. By dividing the workload this way, each compressor applies a smaller amount of gain reduction, avoiding the harshness or artifacts caused by one compressor working too hard. It also lets you address different aspects of the vocal's dynamics more precisely, using the first compressor to tame large peaks with a slower attack and release, and the second to bring consistency to quieter details with a faster attack and release. Another benefit of serial compression is the ability to combine different types of compressors to add tonal color to the vocal if you see fit. There isn't a rule out there that says you can only rely on one compressor per vocal chain. In fact, I often use multiple dynamic processes to treat my vocals, including multiple compressors and even limiters to achieve a consistent forward vocal sound that doesn't sound too affected. If you'd like more insight into how to use serial compression step by step, I'll link to another video I did all about this topic down in the description below. The fourth common vocal compression mistake that I see is only compressing individual channels. We've already discussed that compressing individual channels can make sense in some cases, but there's one area where it almost always makes sense to compress: the vocal group. Why? Well, vocal groups consist of all the vocal tracks in a mix, like leads, ad-libs, backgrounds, harmonies, and they're all a part of the same performance. But what happens when those layers come together at the group level? Chances are volume inconsistencies will emerge as each vocal fights for space. One vocal may dominate, while another gets buried and lost. So what can you do? Apply compression to the entire vocal group. Applying compression to the group as a whole creates a sense of unity among the individual elements, effectively gluing the voices together. This approach helps keep the track balanced, but also prevents individual tracks from poking out, especially as levels increase during parts of the performance. This ultimately helps the vocals sit together more cohesively. And that leads us to the fifth mistake, which is not using multi-band compression. Vocals are complex, and different frequency ranges behave differently. For example, the low end might have excessive energy that muddies up the mix, while the high end can become harsh or piercing. If you apply compression uniformly with a standard compressor, you might fix one issue, but end up over-compressing other areas, and in the process lose important details that make the vocal stand out. Additionally, certain frequency areas, such as the low end, can easily over-trigger the compression, causing the entire frequency range to be reduced, even though only part of it needs to be controlled. To be fair, many compressors include a sidechain filter to help manage this, but what if you still want some control over the low end? Or what if the issue lies in a different part of the frequency spectrum altogether? With multi-band compression, you can address frequency-specific issues with precision. For instance, you can apply more aggressive compression to tame low frequencies, reducing the muddiness or rumble that comes from them, while using lighter compression in the mid-range to preserve clarity and intelligibility. This helps maintain a natural balanced vocal sound while giving you more control over each frequency range. But there's a catch. Overusing multi-band compression can lead to an over-processed, unnatural sound, especially when each band is manipulated too differently from one another. This happens because multi-band compression functions somewhat like a combination of an EQ and a compressor, allowing you to shape the vocal's tone by adjusting the balance between frequency ranges with individual compressors applied on each band. If one band is over-compressed in relation to another, it can create an imbalanced vocal sound where certain frequencies are overly controlled while others are too dynamic. Therefore, it's essential to be mindful of the crossover points between bands and how each band interacts with the others. And for more help with setting up multi-band compression on vocals step by step, be sure to watch my video on that topic, which I'll leave down in the description below. The sixth vocal compression mistake I want to talk about is not using upward compression. Most people are familiar with traditional or downward compression. In fact, when we discuss compression, this is usually the type that comes to mind. With downward compression, the compressor reacts to the loudest parts of the signal. When a peak exceeds the set threshold, the compressor reduces the volume of that part of the signal signal, controlling the loud part, and ultimately ensuring a more balanced sound. This is useful, but it's only half the story when it comes to compressing vocals, and that's where upward compression comes into play. Upward compression works differently by reacting to the quieter parts of the signal. Instead of taming the peaks, it lifts the softer, quieter sections that fall below a threshold, making them more present in the mix. That means that with upward compression, you can enhance the softer parts of a vocal without affecting the louder sections. The goal is ultimately to raise the floor up rather than compress the ceiling down. Here's an example of how you might use upward compression effectively. If your vocal performance has sections where the performer's voice dips in volume during certain phrases or softer notes, upward compression can bring those parts out in a natural way without affecting the louder sections, allowing you to smooth out the dynamics more transparently. Another tip that I can offer you is to combine this with my previous tip around multiband compression. With tools like the FabFilter Pro MB, we can apply upward compression to specific frequency pockets by utilizing a positive range value, enhancing their presence in an EQ-like fashion. For example, I can add an upward band to the top end of a vocal, adding to its airiness and making it shine, but only when the top end isn't too excessively present. This maintains a more balanced dynamic range while keeping the vocal upfront and impactful. And for more help with upward compression, be sure to watch my video on the topic, which I'll leave down in the description below, just like the others. Building on that, the next vocal compression mistake is using the wrong settings. Now, compression settings like attack, release, threshold, ratio, and makeup gain all have a big impact on how your vocal will sound. If these aren't set correctly, you can end up with a vocal that sounds squashed, unnatural, or simply doesn't sit right in the mix. Let's go through each of these settings and discuss how they can make or break your vocal compression, starting with the attack. Attack controls how quickly the compressor kicks in when the vocal reaches the threshold. If your attack is too fast, you can lose the natural punch and transience of the vocal, which means the initial clarity and impact gets squashed. But if it's too slow, the compressor might miss those sudden peaks, making the vocal sound uneven and not working much at all. Therefore, you should set your attack to let some of the natural punch of the vocal through while still controlling the peaks effectively. This is typically going to be a medium fast setting, somewhere between 10 to 30 milliseconds. But of course, don't solely rely on this range. Set up your compressor and listen as you adjust the attack to find the sweet spot. The goal should be to find a balance, making sure that the attack isn't so slow that there's no noticeable gain reduction, but also not so fast that it disrupts the smooth, natural flow of the vocal. Next, we have the release. The release determines how quickly the compressor stops acting after the vocal drops back below the threshold. If it's set too fast, your vocal can sound choppy or overly controlled, especially in a dynamic performance. But if it's too slow, the compressor might still be clamping down when it needs to let go, which can lead to an unnatural overcompressed sound. Therefore, a moderate release, somewhere between 50 to 150 milliseconds, often works well, letting the vocal breathe naturally without losing control. Again, use your ears when dialing this in to find the best setting for your vocal. The goal is to ultimately avoid a release that's so fast that it creates a choppy, stuttering effect, while also preventing it from being too slow, which would leave the vocal constantly compressed, even when it's not being performed. Before we dive into the other two parameters, it's important to note that the attack and release are really responsible for the tone of the compressor. Therefore, I'd highly recommend you check out my video dedicated to attack and release and setting it optimally in particular. I'll leave a link to that down in the description below for you to check out later. Next up is the threshold. Threshold is the level at which the compressor starts working. The audio needs to pass the threshold in order for the compressor to work. If it doesn't, the compressor isn't actually compressing the material and therefore isn't producing any gain reduction. Set it too high and you'll barely hear any compression, if any at all. Too low and you'll compress everything, flattening the dynamics completely. Therefore, a good approach is to set the threshold so you're achieving around 2 to 3 dB of gain reduction on the loudest parts or the peaks of the vocal. This ultimately allows for natural dynamics to still come through while controlling those peaks without overdoing it. And finally, we have the ratio. The ratio determines how much compression is applied once the vocal crosses the threshold. A very high ratio, like 8:1 or more, will squash the vocal hard, which might be suitable for extreme effects, but can sound unnatural in most vocal mixes. On the other hand, if the ratio is too low, like 2:1, it might not provide enough control depending on the vocal. Therefore, a moderate ratio around 3:1 or 4:1 is likely a good starting point for vocals, keeping them contained but without sacrificing their natural feel. After adjusting these compression settings in your mix, it's important to dial in the appropriate amount of makeup gain to compensate for the amount of volume that you're losing through this compression process. Makeup gain compensates for volume loss, but finding the right amount isn't always straightforward. Apply too much, and you might boost the vocal level to a point where it sounds louder than the other elements in the mix. This can lead to loudness bias, where the vocal sounds better because it's louder, but not because it's more balanced or clearer. On the other hand, under-applying makeup gain can leave the vocal sounding quieter than it should be, making it harder to fit in with the rest of the mix, even though the compressor is doing its job. A good rule of thumb is to apply just enough makeup gain so that when you bypass the compressor and put it in, there isn't a noticeable volume difference. Essentially, we're trying to match the loudness to just compensate for what we're losing and make it sound comparable to how the vocal sounded before compression was applied in the first place. Even if you're losing, say, 3 dB on a vocal, you don't need to add all of that 3 dB back. Remember, compression primarily reduces the loudest peaks, not the entire vocal. So chances are it's not that the whole track is 3 dB quieter, but rather just the peaks. Therefore, a more moderate addition of 1 to 2 dB to the makeup gain might be all that's needed to bridge the gap, making the vocal sit more comfortably in the mix, but without overboosting. As with everything in mixing, listen critically and use your judgment in the moment. Adding too little makeup gain can make the vocal sound weaker than where you first started, while adding too much can distort the balance and lead to biases in decision making. And speaking of making decisions, this brings us to our 8th mistake, which is using the wrong compressor for your vocal. Compressors come in different flavors, and each one has a unique way of shaping the sound. Therefore, understanding the difference between these compressor types can help you make a more informed decision about which compressor to use on your track specifically. Let's break down some common types and how they affect the sound. First, we have optical compressors. Opto compressors are known for their smooth and transparent compression. They typically have just two controls: peak reduction and makeup gain. The lack of an adjustable attack and release setting means they tend to have slower, more natural response times. These compressors are great for vocals that need smooth control, as they apply compression gently, which can result in a more cohesive musical sound. Therefore, if you want something that doesn't distort the natural feel of your vocal, an opto compressor is probably the way to go. Next up, we have FET compressors. FET compressors are fast, aggressive, and more responsive compared to optos. They're great for adding presence and punch to vocals. FETs are known for their characteristic color and slight distortion, which can make a vocal sound more upfront and exciting. If your vocal needs to cut through a dense mix, or if you want to add a bit of grit to your sound, a FET compressor could be a great fit for you. However, it's important to keep in mind that they could be much more in your face and less transparent than opto compressors. So if you're looking for a more transparent sounding form of compression, then you probably want to steer clear of FETs altogether. Next, we have VCA compressors, which are some of the most flexible compressors out there. VCA stands for voltage controlled amplifier, and these compressors allow you to adjust the attack, release, threshold, ratio, and makeup gain, giving you complete control over the compression process. Because of their precision, VCA compressors are widely used in modern mixing, especially when you need detailed control over dynamics. If you want to get very specific with how your vocal sits in the mix, a VCA compressor is a great tool, and they tend to be more on the transparent sounding side of things. Tube compressors are another type to consider. They add warmth, smoothness, and a subtle harmonic distortion that can really enhance a vocal's tonal quality. They also tend to be slower in their response time compared to FET compressors, which makes them great for adding musicality to a vocal performance. Therefore, if you want to have vocals that are lush and rich, or if you just want to add a vintage type of vibe, then a tube compressor could be a fantastic choice for your situation. But you also have to be careful with a tube compressor, because applying too much can make a vocal sound too muddy or too saturated. So it's extremely important to apply them in moderation if you're using them, unless you want that character. But the key takeaway here is that when choosing your compressor, consider not only the controls and features, but also how it'll affect the presence and character of your vocal as a whole. And if you want to learn more about the nuances of each of these compressor types, and more importantly what they sound like, be sure to watch my video on that topic, which I will leave down in the description below. Mistake number 9 is ignoring the sidechain. Compression is not just for reducing dynamic range and improving consistency. It has other creative uses, like helping you prioritize certain vocals over others, or even over competing elements in the mix through sidechain compression. This is especially useful when you're trying to make sure a lead vocal stands out over background vocals, or other vocal stacks that can creep up and create congestion, making the mix sound muddy and less clear. One of my go-to methods is to send all background vocals to a bus separate from the lead. I then apply a compressor to the bus and set the lead vocals to act as the key that triggers the sidechain, ultimately ensuring that the lead vocal always takes priority when they're being performed at the same time. I've got a whole video dedicated to setting up sidechain compression compression around vocals effectively, which I'll leave down in the description below if you want to see a deeper dive into this topic. But if you're struggling to make your lead vocals stand out against backgrounds or even other competing sounds in the mix, give sidechain compression a try and it might just be the fix you've been looking for. And while I briefly mentioned parallel compression in this video, I have a whole video dedicated to that topic that I think you should watch next, as it really helps create this thickness and presence in the vocal. I'm gonna leave that video on screen right here for you to watch next. If you got value out of the video, please smash that like button, and of course subscribe if you're new to see more mixing tips like this in the future. I appreciate y'all for watching, and I look forward to helping y'all again soon. Peace.
5